It took Secretary of State Marco Rubio exactly 26 minutes to tear through one of the most carefully polished political identities in modern American politics, and he did not need classified intelligence, anonymous sources, whispered leaks, or some dramatic last minute revelation to do it. He used public records, Alexandria Ocasio Cortez's own disclosures, documented political history, and one faded photograph of his parents that had been carried close enough to him to make every polished talking point in the room suddenly look cheap. The entire confrontation turned on a mistake that should have been obvious the moment Alexandria Ocasio Cortez decided to call Marco Rubio's immigrant story branding, because there are political insults that irritate an opponent, and there are political insults that hand him the exact weapon he has been waiting to use. She attacked the son of a Cuban bartender and a hotel maid as though hardship were a trademark she alone had registered, as though saying the Bronx often enough automatically granted moral ownership over struggle, work, immigration, and sacrifice. And while Alexandria Ocasio Cortez spoke, Marco Rubio did something far more dangerous than interrupting her. He listened. For 15 straight minutes, Alexandria Ocasio Cortez delivered the kind of attack that had worked for her before. Sharp enough for clips, personal enough for headlines, and framed carefully enough to make every camera in the House Foreign Affairs Committee room useful to her political brand. She hit immigration, family separation, Rubio's education, his political evolution, his connections, his biography, and finally, the story of his parents, treating the accumulated sacrifices of two immigrant workers like campaign packaging assembled by consultants. Behind her, staffers held phones ready because the expectation was obvious. This was supposed to become another viral confrontation, another scene cut into vertical clips, another headline declaring that Alexandria Ocasio Cortez had humiliated a Republican official under the committee lights. Marco Rubio did not give her the reaction shot they wanted, did not cut her off, did not perform outrage, and did not rescue himself with theatrical indignation. He simply made notes on one sheet of paper and waited until Alexandria Ocasio Cortez had finished building the argument he was about to take apart. The hearing itself had begun as something far less dramatic, a routine appearance by Secretary Rubio before the House Foreign Affairs Committee to discuss diplomatic priorities, with C-SPAN feeds running, network cameras positioned around the room, and a gallery unusually crowded with younger observers carrying more phones than notebooks. For the first hour, the questions followed the expected foreign policy circuit: China, NATO, Middle Eastern diplomacy, and the familiar pressures that come with representing the United States abroad in a period when almost every major region carries some kind of strategic risk. Rubio answered with the controlled precision of a man who had spent years immersed in foreign affairs and who, according to the script, had been confirmed by the Senate in a 99-0 vote, an almost absurd level of agreement in a political culture that can argue over the color of the carpet. Then the chairman recognized Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the atmosphere changed because she did not approach the microphone as if she had several narrow questions about diplomatic policy. She approached it as if the hearing room were already a studio. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez opened by attacking Rubio's transformation from what she characterized as a more moderate Republican into a senior official serving an administration she accused of separating families at the border. She said he had abandoned principles he once claimed to hold, then shifted from policy to biography, arguing that Marco Rubio had attended elite law schools, benefited from connections, and converted the story of his family into a political asset. Then came the word that changed the hearing: branding. That was the point at which the argument stopped being about immigration policy and became a direct challenge to whether Marco Rubio's parents, their work, and the life they built in America represented something authentic or something manufactured for political effect. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did not merely question his policy judgment, she questioned the legitimacy of the story he had spent his career telling about where he came from. She then reached for the Washington Post dispute over the timeline of Rubio's family leaving Cuba, emphasizing that his parents arrived in the United States in 1956 before Fidel Castro formally took power in 1959, and using that discrepancy to suggest that the entire narrative had been embellished. From there, she widened the attack, telling Rubio that he did not represent working people, that he represented the donor class, while she represented the Bronx, allowing those three words to carry an enormous amount of political weight. I represent the Bronx was not simply a geographical statement in the context of her argument. It was presented as proof of authenticity, proof of hardship, proof that she understood lives Rubio supposedly no longer understood. Staffers behind her continued aiming phones at Rubio because the expected ending was clear, and the progressive social media machinery was already preparing to turn his silence into evidence that he had been beaten. But that silence was not surrender, and the faint smile that appeared when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez invoked the Bronx was the first visible sign that she had walked directly into the subject Rubio had prepared to discuss. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez finally stopped, Marco Rubio waited through 3 seconds of silence before answering, and the temperature of the room changed without his voice ever becoming loud. He thanked her, acknowledged that she had said a great deal about him and his family, and then reduced the entire 15-minute performance to 3 claims he wanted placed clearly on the record. She knew what struggle looked like. She represented the Bronx, and his life story was branding. Rubio opened his folder and answered the insult at its foundation, beginning not with polling data or party labels, but with the people Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had dragged into the fight. His father, Mario Rubio, had been a bartender in Miami, a man who spent decades standing behind a counter making drinks for customers who often never bothered to learn his name. His mother, Oriales, worked as a hotel maid, cleaning rooms, changing sheets, scrubbing bathrooms, riding the bus to work because a second car was beyond the family budget, and coming home from those shifts carrying the physical cost of labor no social media slogan could imitate. Rubio described his parents arriving from Cuba in 1956 without English, influential connections, wealth, a trust fund, a political network, or any institutional advantage waiting to receive them. What they had, according to the story Rubio had told for years, was each other and a belief that the United States might give their children an opportunity greater than the one available to them. That was the moment his answer stopped being defensive, because instead of spending the hearing trying to prove that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had misunderstood his biography, Rubio turned the same standard of authenticity back toward the person who had challenged him. Now let's talk about you. It was a short transition, almost plain, but it shifted the burden instantly because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had made personal history fair territory, and Marco Rubio was prepared to examine hers with the same enthusiasm she had shown for examining his. Rubio focused on the phrase "girl from the Bronx," the identity Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had repeatedly woven into speeches, campaign messaging, interviews, and social media branding. He acknowledged the part nobody disputed. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was born in the Bronx. Then he moved to the part that complicated the image, stating that her family moved when she was 5 years old to Yorktown Heights in Westchester County, a suburban community with a median household income he placed at roughly $138,000. He reminded the room that she attended Yorktown High School and noted that classmates knew her as Sandy Cortez, turning what had been a grand argument about authenticity into something brutally ordinary: school records, a hometown, a yearbook, and an address. Rubio also invoked New York Assemblyman Matt Slater, who attended high school with her and had publicly mocked what he called the AOC Bronx mythology, describing her as Sandy Cortez from Yorktown High School who lived near Friends Road and Longview Street. That contrast landed harder because Rubio did not need to argue that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had never experienced difficulty. He only needed to challenge the version of her background she had just used as a weapon against his family. He contrasted his mother cleaning hotel rooms in Miami with the account that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's mother cleaned tutors' homes in exchange for SAT preparation, then reduced the point to a sentence designed to make every broader ideological claim secondary. Those were not the same struggle. Rubio said he grew up in a neighborhood where people were shot, while describing Yorktown Heights as a community where homes could cost around $700,000 and where ordinary suburban disputes were far removed from the hardship Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had invoked moments earlier. She responded that she had always been transparent about growing up between the Bronx and Yorktown, but Rubio seized on the word transparent because transparency becomes an awkward defense when the political brand has depended overwhelmingly on emphasizing one side of that geography. His point was not that being born in the Bronx was false. His point was that repeatedly presenting the Bronx as the defining proof of working-class authenticity while minimizing Westchester was exactly the kind of selective biography she had just accused him of creating. Rubio then returned to the Washington Post timeline Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had used against him, and, instead of avoiding the discrepancy, leaned directly into it. His parents had arrived in 1956 before Castro took power, he said, and when that timeline had been challenged publicly, he acknowledged the correction rather than pretending the dates were something else. That distinction became the knife edge of his rebuttal. An authentic story can survive a corrected date because the life underneath it remains real, while a political identity built around carefully selected details becomes much more fragile when the missing context is dragged into the light. Rubio accused Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of responding differently whenever critics raised Yorktown Heights, arguing that rather than simply clarifying the balance between the Bronx and Westchester, she attacked the motives of the people raising the question. By then, the hearing was no longer moving according to the script her staff had expected, because Marco Rubio had not merely survived the first attack, he had taken the language of branding, struggle, and the Bronx, and turned all three against the person who introduced them. And Rubio was not finished, because biography was only the opening section of the folder sitting in front of him. The next section moved away from childhood, neighborhoods, yearbooks, and family mythology, and toward something much harder to soften with personal explanation. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's record representing working people in her own district. The attack was about to leave Westchester and move directly into Queens, where one corporate decision, 25,000 promised jobs, billions of dollars in projected wages, and a political victory lap would become the next test of the image she had spent years presenting to the country. Rubio had allowed Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to define the standard herself, who actually understood working people, who protected them, and who merely talked about them. Now he was ready to apply that standard to Amazon. Rubio moved directly into the Amazon headquarters fight, because if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wanted the hearing to be about who actually understood working people, then her own district offered a much cleaner test than any slogan about class identity. In 2018, Amazon announced plans to build its second headquarters in Long Island City, Queens, a deal that was projected to bring 25,000 jobs with an average salary of roughly $150,000 and generate about $12 billion in economic activity flowing through the surrounding community. Rubio laid out the arithmetic with the kind of simplicity that makes ideological explanations suddenly look expensive. 25,000 jobs multiplied by an average salary of $150,000 represented approximately $375 billion in annual wages going to workers, households, businesses, landlords, restaurants, transportation, services, and the local tax base. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez opposed the project, condemned the arrangement as corporate welfare, organized against it, helped turn it into a political target, and celebrated when Amazon ultimately abandoned the Queen's plan. That was the moment Rubio transformed what her supporters had called a progressive victory into a much harsher question. If you claim to fight for working people, what exactly do you call 25,000 working opportunities that disappeared after your campaign succeeded? He then produced the image of the Job Creators Network billboard in Times Square, the one that bluntly mocked the anniversary of what it described as 25,000 jobs lost, and the visual worked because Rubio did not need to embellish the message beyond the numbers already sitting in front of the room. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had spent years describing the Amazon deal as an example of government handing billions to one of the richest corporations on earth. But Rubio attacked the framing itself by emphasizing that the incentives were tied to economic activity and employment that had not yet arrived. The point was not that Amazon deserved sympathy, and Rubio did not try to make the corporation look charitable. The point was that the people who would have received the paychecks were not billionaires, lobbyists, or executives, but workers who would have been earning salaries inside and around her district. Then he moved to December 2019, when Amazon leased office space elsewhere in Manhattan for roughly 1,500 employees, a development Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez publicly treated as evidence that her opposition had been vindicated. Rubio reduced that celebration to a fraction written large enough for the cameras to understand. 1,500 out of 25,000 was 6%, meaning the supposed victory preserved a sliver of the jobs while losing 94% of the original scale. That 94% was the part ideology could not make disappear, because even the most aggressive rhetoric about subsidies could not turn 1,500 positions outside the original district into the equivalent of 25,000 projected positions inside it. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez answered that the original agreement involved $3.5 billion in corporate subsidies. But Rubio countered that these were tax incentives tied to jobs and revenue that did not yet exist, meaning the government was not simply writing Amazon a check from a pile of money already collected. He argued that Amazon would have paid taxes, hired tens of thousands of workers, and injected spending into Queens, while those workers would have bought food, paid rent, used local services, sent money through the local economy, and built lives around employment that vanished when the deal collapsed. Rubio's criticism was not subtle. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had preferred the political headline of defeating a giant corporation to the far less glamorous work of explaining to individual workers why their anticipated jobs no longer existed. That was where he introduced David Reyes, the Dominican construction worker from Queens, whose story in the script served as the human cost behind the abstract number. According to Rubio's account, David Reyes was a second-generation American who expected to work on the Amazon campus for roughly $100,000 a year with benefits and a pension, the kind of job that does not fit neatly into a viral ideological argument, because it is difficult to dismiss a worker once his paycheck has a face attached to it. After the deal died, Reyes spent 8 months unemployed before finding work paying approximately $42,000 a year without benefits and with a 90-minute commute, a brutal downgrade that Rubio used to strip away the protective language around the Amazon fight. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had said she was shielding ordinary people from corporate welfare, but Rubio's counterargument was that a working man who lost access to a six-figure job was not protected by the destruction of that opportunity. He accused her of sacrificing material gains for workers in exchange for political symbolism, then celebrating the outcome on Twitter because the public relations victory arrived immediately, while the financial consequences were scattered across individual households nobody outside Queens would ever see. That distinction between symbolism and wages became the foundation for his next attack, because Rubio wanted the hearing to stay focused on the difference between what political language promises and what policy actually produces. He invoked Cuba not to relitigate his childhood, but to sharpen the ideological point, saying that governments built around hostility toward private enterprise can spend decades promising that the state will provide what private employers supposedly exploit, only to leave workers earning almost nothing. Rubio cited an average monthly salary in Cuba of roughly $30 and used that figure as a warning against treating economic slogans as substitutes for functioning markets, jobs, investment, and individual opportunity. His line was brutal because it was designed to collapse the moral grandeur around anti-corporate rhetoric into the most basic working class question possible. Does the slogan pay the rent? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had entered the hearing claiming moral authority over struggle, but Rubio was now forcing that claim through the test of paychecks, wages, lost jobs, and the measurable consequences of a political campaign she had proudly helped lead. From there, he moved naturally into the policy most closely associated with her national image, the Green New Deal, where the gap between rhetoric and measurable outcomes became even wider. Rubio described the Green New Deal as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's signature legislative project and walked through its broad ambitions: eliminating fossil fuels within a decade, retrofitting buildings across the country, guaranteeing jobs, expanding healthcare and education, and providing economic security at a scale that reached into almost every major category of American life. He cited an American Action Forum estimate of approximately $93 trillion, a number so enormous that Rubio compared it with the recorded spending of the United States government since the Constitution was ratified, using the comparison to make the price tag sound less like a policy proposal than a mathematical provocation. He then returned to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's own explanation that the resolution would effectively cost zero if passed because it was non-binding and represented values rather than direct appropriations. An answer Rubio treated as evidence of the gap between the political appeal of the proposal and the discipline required to explain how anything in it would actually be financed. The Senate vote became his cleanest exhibit. 0 senators voting in favor, 57 against, with Democrats largely voting present rather than attaching their names to the proposal. Rubio's point was devastating precisely because he did not need Republican opposition to make it. Her own side had refused to cast affirmative votes for the initiative most closely identified with her political brand. Then he shifted from one failed legislative test to a broader measurement of her effectiveness in Congress using the Center for Effective Lawmaking, a nonpartisan project associated with Vanderbilt University and the University of Virginia. According to the ranking Rubio cited, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood 230th out of 240 House Democrats and last among the 19 Democrats from New York, a position that made her enormous national profile look strangely disconnected from legislative output. He said she had introduced 21 substantive bills and that none received committee action, none received a floor vote, and none became law, making the number 0 suddenly more damaging than any insult he could have invented. Rubio contrasted that record with fellow squad member Rashida Tlaib, who ranked substantially higher and had managed to move legislation through committee, undercutting any attempt to dismiss the ranking as something that automatically punished progressives. Then he delivered the contrast that cut directly through the hearing: 13 million Twitter followers and 0 laws. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez answered that legislative effectiveness could not be measured by bills alone, but Rubio's response pushed the obvious question back across the table. If not legislation, then what exactly was Congress supposed to measure? Tweets, Instagram stories, viral clips, and personal branding might expand influence, but they were not statutes, committee victories, floor votes, or signed laws, and Rubio was clearly determined to separate political celebrity from the dull machinery of governing. When he mentioned Met Gala dresses, the attack moved into territory even more visually damaging because there was no need to explain the imagery to anyone who had seen the photographs. The September 2021 Met Gala had a reported ticket price of $35,000, a guest list filled with celebrities, billionaires, fashion executives, and cultural elites. And in the middle of that spectacle stood Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in a white dress emblazoned with the words, "Tax the Rich," in red. Rubio did not need to accuse her of hypocrisy in abstract language, because the scene itself was already waiting to make the argument for him. He described the dress as costing more than $1,000 and pointed to the now familiar footage of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walking through the event maskless while a masked woman behind her carried the train of the dress to keep it off the floor. That single image, Rubio argued, compressed the contradiction more effectively than any speech. The politician wearing a slogan against the wealthy was attending one of the most exclusive parties in America, while someone in a service role physically managed the garment behind her. He noted that even Black Lives Matter Greater New York had criticized the appearance as performative and not particularly socialist, making clear that the backlash had not been limited to conservatives looking for an easy attack. Then Rubio returned to the economics of the ticket itself, comparing $35,000 with the roughly $47,000 median household income he cited for the Bronx and Queens portions of her district, meaning admission to one evening could equal roughly 74% of what an average household there earned in an entire year. And, just as he had done with Amazon, Rubio turned symbolism back into arithmetic, because once a political brand claims to speak for working people, numbers have an irritating habit of exposing how far the performance can drift from the people supposedly being represented. Rubio's point was not that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had committed some unforgivable sin by attending a glamorous event, because that would have been too easy for her to dismiss as resentment towards celebrity, wealth, or access. His argument was much narrower and therefore much more damaging. She had turned economic class into a moral performance, condemned the rich as a political identity, and then stepped onto a red carpet surrounded by the exact people she spent the rest of the year denouncing. The phrase, "tax the rich," was supposed to signal defiance, but inside a room where a single ticket reportedly cost $35,000, it looked less like rebellion than a slogan printed for an audience wealthy enough to enjoy being mocked. Rubio emphasized that the average household in her district lived in an economic universe completely removed from that ballroom, one where rent, groceries, transportation, childcare, and utility bills competed for the same limited paycheck every month. To him, the image was not revolutionary, it was costume theater performed at a price point most of the people she claimed to champion could never reasonably touch. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez defended her attendance by noting that New York elected officials were invited guests of the Metropolitan Museum. But Rubio refused to let the argument drift toward whether she had personally purchased the ticket. He made clear that the issue was not admission, protocol, or whether public officials were traditionally present at the event, because none of those details erased the contradiction sitting inside the photograph. She had entered an elite gathering preaching against elite wealth, walked through the room without a mask while service workers around her remained masked, and relied on a worker behind her to physically manage the train of a dress carrying a message about economic inequality. Rubio returned to his mother, not as a sentimental escape from the facts, but as a brutal contrast, reminding the room that his mother had made beds for wealthy people while Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wore political slogans for wealthy people. Those two images, he argued, were not remotely the same relationship to work, class, service, or sacrifice. The comparison sharpened because Rubio kept returning to labor rather than fame, because his entire rebuttal rested on separating the people who performed work from politicians who performed solidarity with workers. His mother, scrubbed rooms, changed sheets, rode buses, counted tips, and came home exhausted without cameras documenting any of it, while Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had built a national political identity around displaying solidarity in places designed to attract cameras. That was why the Met Gala image mattered inside his broader argument. It was not a random culture war detour, it was evidence supporting the same accusation he had been constructing since the moment she called his immigrant story branding. She had accused Marco Rubio of converting Biography into political marketing, and he was now arguing that her entire public persona operated through symbols selected precisely because they photographed well, circulated quickly, and reinforced an identity more efficiently than legislative accomplishments ever could. The dress, in that frame, became less about fashion than about the political economy of attention. Then Rubio turned to campaign finance, the area where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had spent years presenting herself as unusually clean, transparent, people-funded, and separate from the corporate political machinery she accused other members of serving. He recalled the image she had cultivated through phrases like 100% people-funded and opposition to corporate passy money, an identity built partly on the implication that her financial practices were morally cleaner than the Washington system surrounding her. He also invoked her aggressive questioning of Michael Cohen, noting how aggressively she had pursued financial details and how commentators had praised her ability to dig through transactions, disclosures, assets, and money trails when the target was somebody else. Rubio's purpose was obvious. A politician who demands forensic transparency from opponents cannot suddenly declare her own financial structures too complicated, too partisan, or too technical for scrutiny. Once again, the standard she had spent years imposing on others was about to be applied to her. Rubio brought up her former chief of staff and campaign manager Saikat Chakrabarty and the organization Brand New Congress, focusing on approximately $1 million that had moved through related entities and companies controlled by Chakrabarty. He referenced the Federal Election Commission filings and the formal complaint filed by the National Legal and Policy Center, which alleged that the transfers had been structured in a way that obscured spending and avoided disclosure requirements. Rubio did not claim that the filing of a complaint itself proved guilt, but he used the underlying transactions to attack the moral certainty with which Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had presented her campaign operation as fundamentally different from the political machines she criticized. The complaint mattered in his argument because it emerged from her own disclosures, not from an anonymous rumor, leaked gossip, or some mysterious spreadsheet manufactured by a hostile campaign. Her own financial documents had provided the numbers that critics later used to question whether the rhetoric of total transparency matched the structure of the money. Rubio noted that Chakrabarty left Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's congressional office in August 2019 during the period of intense scrutiny, then moved to the more recent payments that made the financial section of the hearing even more uncomfortable. According to the campaign filings cited in the script, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's campaign paid a psychiatrist, Dr. Brian Bowl, $18,725 through 3 payments classified as leadership training and consulting. Rubio carefully avoided speculating about personal medical treatment and instead focused on federal campaign finance law, particularly the prohibition against converting campaign funds to personal use. His argument was simple. If the payments genuinely covered legitimate campaign consulting, then the classification could stand on its own. But if they covered personal services disguised as political consulting, the very disclosure system Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez championed would become the basis for examining them. That distinction allowed him to stay inside the documents without needing to make claims beyond what the filings actually showed. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez pushed back by pointing out that the complaints came from partisan organizations. A predictable defense because the identity of a complainant can easily become a substitute argument when the underlying records are difficult to explain in a sound bite? Rubio answered by separating the accuser from the evidence, emphasizing that the organizations had not invented the payments, invented the entities, or fabricated the campaign reports. The numbers originated in her own filings, the same kind of documents she had repeatedly demanded that political opponents disclose and defend. That was the trap running through the entire hearing. She had entered assuming Marco Rubio would be forced to defend himself against her moral standards, but he kept demonstrating that those standards became far less comfortable when applied in reverse. By the time he closed the folder, the fight had moved from immigration to biography, from biography to jobs, from jobs to legislation, from legislation to celebrity, and from celebrity to money without ever leaving the public record described in the script. Then the documents disappeared, and the hearing changed again, because Marco Rubio no longer needed rankings, reports, filings, bill counts, ticket prices, or campaign classifications to make the final point. He placed the folder aside, put both hands on the table, and returned to the place Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had started 15 minutes earlier, his family. She had called his life story branding and suggested that his political identity had been constructed around a convenient immigrant narrative. So Rubio stripped the answer back to the bartender and the hotel maid whose names had been pulled into the confrontation. His father had stood behind a bar for 30 years, pouring drinks, collecting tips, and providing for his family without presenting his labor as a political philosophy. His mother had cleaned hotel rooms until her back hurt and her hands cracked, then returned home believing that the exhaustion was worth it if her children could someday live differently. Rubio described parents who did not write manifestos about the service economy, did not demand public recognition, did not go viral, and did not need to transform hardship into content because their work existed long before anyone thought it was politically useful. Then he reached inside his jacket and produced the small, worn photograph that had been waiting there throughout the entire exchange, the photograph of Mario and Oriales Rubio on the day they became American citizens. The edges were softened, the colors faded, and the picture carried none of the polished visual language of a campaign advertisement, which was exactly why Rubio used it as the final answer to the accusation that his family story was a manufactured brand. His father was wearing the only suit he owned, his mother was wearing a dress she had made herself, and the two of them were standing outside the federal courthouse in Miami smiling after becoming citizens of the country they had chosen. Rubio held the photograph toward Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and suddenly every argument about branding, struggle, authenticity, working people, and the American dream had been reduced to one image sitting between them. That photograph became Rubio's answer to everything Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had tried to reduce to branding because the image did not need consultants, slogans, hashtags, or a carefully staged red carpet to explain what it represented. Rubio said this was the American dream as his parents had lived it. Two people who arrived with almost nothing, worked jobs most politicians only mentioned during campaign season, became citizens, and spent their lives trying to make sure their children would stand somewhere higher than they had been allowed to stand. Then he turned the comparison back toward Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez one final time, moving through the record he had just laid out without reopening every argument. She had built her identity around the Bronx while spending most of her childhood in Yorktown, presented herself as the champion of working people while helping defeat a project promising 25,000 jobs, promoted the Green New Deal as a national economic transformation that received 0 Senate votes in favor, ranked 230th out of 240 Democrats in legislative effectiveness, attended a $35,000 per ticket gala in a tax the rich dress, and defended campaign finance structures that had themselves drawn formal complaints. Rubio's point was no longer that one contradiction existed, it was that the contradictions formed a pattern, and the pattern looked remarkably similar to the very thing she had accused him of manufacturing. He stood without theatrics and drew the distinction as sharply as he could. His story began with a bartender, a hotel maid, a courthouse in Miami, and decades of work that happened whether cameras were present or not. Her political story, as Rubio framed it, began with the Bronx but ran through Westchester, began with working class rhetoric but reached the Met Gala, began with people-funded branding but ended with FEC complaints, and began with legislative revolution but had produced no laws from the bills he cited. Then came the line designed to close the entire argument rather than extend it. His parents had earned their American dream while she had manufactured hers. Rubio argued that ordinary Americans who worked double shifts, cleaned rooms, poured drinks, drove buses, worried about rent, and never received invitations to elite galas were perfectly capable of recognizing the difference between hardship lived privately and hardship performed publicly. He buttoned his jacket and delivered the final insult with the same controlled tone he had maintained throughout the exchange. Tell him what a politician boasts about, and he would tell you what that politician lacks. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had boasted about the Bronx, Rubio said, and what she lacked was the truth behind the version of that identity she had placed at the center of the confrontation. The hearing room went still, and the script describes Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sitting motionless as her chief of staff leaned toward her and whispered before she asked the chairman for a brief recess. Rubio simply gathered his folder and the photograph of his parents, said he had nothing further, and told the chairman that the record could speak for itself. There was no shouting match, no desk pounding, no final burst of theatrical outrage, because the political damage in the script came from the contrast between 15 minutes of accusation and a response constructed almost entirely from records Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez could not dismiss merely by objecting to Rubio's tone. The clip that immediately mattered was not another screaming congressional confrontation, but the moment she requested a recess after Rubio had finished walking through the evidence he had prepared. According to the script, the footage spread within minutes, but the image that traveled fastest was Rubio holding the faded citizenship photograph of his parents while saying that they had earned their American dream. Within 48 hours, the hearing was described as having crossed 90 million views across platforms, while Sandy from Westchester trended globally for 4 days, and the side-by-side comparison between Rubio's parents outside the courthouse and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez at the Met Gala became a political meme template. Her office responded that evening with a written statement characterizing the hearing as a coordinated effort to silence a woman of color who fought for working families. But the script emphasizes what the statement did not address: Yorktown Heights, the 25,000 Amazon jobs, the legislative effectiveness ranking, and the campaign finance complaints Rubio had used as the backbone of his attack. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez followed with a 47-minute Instagram Live that was emotional, defiant, and effective with her existing supporters. But the narrative argues that the more important audience was the group that did not automatically rally to her defense. Independent voters, moderate Democrats, older constituents, and people already skeptical of the squad were described as replaying the hearing rather than accepting either side's summary of it. The script attributes to CNN's Jake Tapper a description of the exchange as cross-examination built around public records, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's disclosures, and a nonpartisan academic ranking, while the New York Times and Vanity Fair are portrayed as publishing pieces questioning the broader problem of authenticity inside progressive politics. Then the consequences moved beyond headlines, because according to the source narrative, the FEC opened a formal review of the brand new Congress PAC transfers within 3 weeks, and Saikat Chakrabarty's financial records were subpoenaed. The $18,125 in payments classified as leadership training and consulting triggered a separate inquiry by the Office of Congressional Conduct, while the IRS Criminal Investigation Division opened its own review of whether any personal expenses paid with campaign funds might create tax implications. Campaign staff were interviewed, and the political issue that had begun as a hearing room confrontation turned into a question about whether expenses had been classified one way for campaign purposes while serving another purpose privately. House Democratic leadership, in the script's telling, reacted with the kind of carefully distanced language Washington uses when loyalty becomes legally inconvenient. Hakeem Jeffries said that every member was responsible for their own filings and that he trusted the oversight process, a statement that offered Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez procedural fairness without offering her political protection. Squad members still issued statements of support, but the script describes those statements as shorter, more cautious, and increasingly lawyered, suggesting that the wall of automatic solidarity around her had begun to crack. Polling in her district then supposedly reflected the same shift, with overall approval dropping 18 points, support among voters over 40 dropping 26 points, and support among Latino voters falling 14 points. For the first time since Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's 2018 upset victory, the source says a primary challenger began attracting both serious money and serious attention. That challenger was Maria Santos, described in the script as a community organizer born and raised in the Bronx who still lived there and operated a small business on Jerome Avenue. Her announcement video lasted only 30 seconds and deliberately avoided spectacle, showing Santos walking through Bronx streets and speaking with neighbors before delivering the line that became the entire contrast of the campaign. She did not need to pretend to be from there because she had never left. The video was described as reaching 20 million views in 1 week, while Santos raised $3.8 million in small dollar donations during her first month, an extraordinary figure for a primary challenger in New York's 14th district. 4 months after the Rubio hearing, the script says the FEC concluded that there was reason to believe campaign finance violations had occurred through the brand new Congress PAC structure. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's campaign then agreed to a $187,000 fine, while the psychiatrist payments were reclassified as personal expenses and ordered reimbursed to campaign funds, and Chakrabarty declined to comment through his attorney. By the time the September primary arrived, the political brand Rubio had attacked in that committee room was facing a challenger whose campaign had turned authenticity itself into the ballot question. Maria Santos defeated Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez by 11 points, according to the script, the largest primary defeat suffered by a squad member, and Santos celebrated at a community center on Grand Concourse with a message stripped of national ideology. The Bronx did not need a brand, it needed a representative. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez conceded, thanked supporters, congratulated Santos, and said nothing about the hearing or the FEC findings that had followed it. She announced that she would explore opportunities in media and advocacy, and within 3 months, the script says, she signed a multi-year agreement with a progressive streaming platform. Rubio's earlier attack about 13 million followers and 0 laws had, in the narrative's deliberately cruel framing, stopped sounding like an insult and started sounding like a job description. The FEC later referred the Chakrabarty matter to the Department of Justice for possible criminal violations, while Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez herself was not charged but was described as a beneficiary in the referral documents. Rubio never publicly celebrated her defeat, and when a reporter asked him about it months later, the script portrays him responding that he wished her well, and that the voters of New York had said everything that needed to be said. When asked what lesson he wanted people to take from the confrontation, Rubio returned to the same principle that had driven his response from the beginning. The American dream is real, but it must be earned honestly, and political branding eventually collapses when someone asks the person selling it to show the work underneath. He had shown his work through the bartender the hotel maid, the long shifts, the courthouse steps, and the photograph carried inside his jacket. The argument ended where it began, not with ideology, but with the difference between a record and a performance. And in Queens, the script closes with David Reyes, the construction worker Rubio had mentioned during the Amazon section, watching Maria Santos win the primary from his apartment while his daughter worked at the kitchen table. He was still working 60 hours a week at a job paying less than half of what the Amazon opportunity would have offered, and the political celebrations on television could not return the salary, pension, benefits, or time that had disappeared with the deal. When his wife asked whether he was okay, Reyes looked at the screen, looked at his daughter, and returned to the one fact that had mattered to him all along. 25,000 jobs had been lost. His was supposed to be one of them, and the politician who helped defeat the project had celebrated the outcome. He did not need the Met Gala, the rankings, the tweets, the campaign complaints, or the national political drama to explain why the hearing mattered to him. Somebody had finally asked the question from the perspective of the worker who was supposed to receive the paycheck. That is the argument the script leaves with the audience. When rhetoric meets receipts, slogans become much harder to hide behind because records do not care how large the social media following is or how perfectly a political identity has been packaged. Marco Rubio entered the hearing carrying the story of two immigrant workers who never became famous, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez entered it carrying a national brand built around working-class authenticity, confrontation, and the language of the Bronx. She came prepared to put his biography on trial, but by attacking his parents, she opened the door for him to examine hers, and once that door was open, Rubio walked through Yorktown Heights, Amazon, the Green New Deal, legislative effectiveness, the Met Gala, campaign finance, and finally, the citizenship photograph waiting in his pocket. The source's conclusion is merciless because it rejects the idea that authenticity can be manufactured indefinitely through repetition. People who actually work, struggle, sacrifice, and build lives without cameras know what labor looks like when they see it. She came to attack the story. He came with the records, and in the logic of this script, only one of them left the room with the right to claim the American dream.